My name is Robert Hunter. I've been in and out of the United States government, mostly out for the last 55 years. I'm going to talk today about a period of time in which I was at the National Security Council staff in the White House during the Jimmy Carter presidency. For the first 2 years, I was in charge of West European affairs, which included NATO and what we now call the European Union, and also worked on strategic nuclear issues in regard to Europe. Now, a lot of people don't understand, and one still is a little reluctant to say this out loud, but the American security relationship with Europe during the Cold War was essentially a suicide pact. We agreed if indeed the Soviet Union Warsaw Pact came across the line with a substantial conventional military attack, at some point, if we weren't able to hold that with conventional forces, we, the United States, would initiate the use of nuclear weapons. And if it was done in Europe, the Soviet Union would respond, and that would have meant the end of the United States as well. It was about deterrence, but it was a suicide pact. Okay. So here we are in the Carter administration, and the most important problem was not to convince the Russians we might do this, but to convince the West Europeans, and particularly the Germans, we might do it. That was always the thing. Can America, across the Atlantic, be relied upon to risk its security for our security? That was the defining issue. Well, on a Sunday morning, a man named Walter Pincus searched through the stuff on Capitol Hill, the budget, and he discovered that there was a weapon that had been approved by NATO, is in the budget, which was called an enhanced radiation weapon. All right, and what this weapon would do, it would go bang, it was a nuclear weapon, but it had a lot of energy in terms of neutrons and everything, but not a lot of blast effect. And so if you had a bunch of Soviet tanks coming across, you could flash one of these things, which would be about half the power of a Hiroshima weapon, and you'd have all these tanks out there. It wouldn't destroy the tanks, but it'd kill everybody inside of it. Or if you had to do it in an urban situation with the enemy investing it, and all the civilians gone, you'd kill all the Warsaw Pact troops, but you wouldn't destroy the city. Now, whether it was a good idea or not, I'll just say, but somebody thought it up. Well, Pincus put this in the Washington Post, and he gave it a name. He said it called it the Neutron bomb. I read the Outlook section that day, and I go, I know what this is. Next morning, I get a call from my boss, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor. He says, what the hell is Pincus talking about? I said, I don't know. And he called Harold Brown, the Secretary of Defense. He said, I don't know what they're talking about. And they went back and they discovered, yes, somebody stuck this in the budget. And yes, it had actually been approved by NATO. Well, suddenly, we had a crisis about the United States was going to have a bomb which would kill people but not destroy real estate. The ultimate inhumane bomb. Well, it was all about deterrence and that sort of thing, but suddenly all of the psychology of deterrence came out in the open. Well, everybody, the president, incidentally, and this is something I don't know has ever come out, and I hope I don't get in trouble for this, on the first report that went to the president and the results of which came back to those of us worker bees, and the president had written on the side of that in his wonderful copperplate handwriting, I do not want to be the world ogre. Well, everybody decided, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, all the military, the president couldn't stop this thing, because if you did, that would look to the Allies like we weren't willing to run risks on the United States for the security of Europe by running the ultimate risk of a nuclear war if deterrence failed. And so we were off and running to the races. Not what the president said he wanted, but what everybody else said he had to have. So we went on for a year trying to convince the Allies, yes, we have to go forward with this weapon. Now, Carter said very clearly, and he's a very smart guy, he said, look, I'm not going to produce this thing unless somebody's prepared to deploy it. Well, that came down to, would the Germans deploy it? Because Germany was on the front line, indeed, and if there were going to be an attack by the Soviet Union through the so-called Fulda Gap and all of that. Well, the Germans came back and said, you know, they had a lot of reaction in their public opinion against this, but they also knew that they needed to have the U.S. guarantee, and they were on the spot. So they came back and said, well, we won't do it unless some other country does it. And the other country they had in mind, given the geography, was the Netherlands. Well, after about a year, Carter finally said, I've had enough of this. I'm not going to produce this thing. Come on, this is just stupid. We're not going to get stuck with this kind of thing if the Allies really don't want it. Well, at that point, the German foreign minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, came hot-footing it over to Washington, met with the president. Got to do this, Mr. President. He said, no, wait a second. I'm not going to produce it unless you will deploy it. Will you deploy it? He said, well, only if the Dutch will also deploy it. Will the Dutch deploy it? No. Then you won't? No. Okay, I'm not going to produce it. And he killed it. Well, the German Chancellor, Helmut Schmidt, who was a street fighter from Hamburg, who always thought he could lecture the President of the United States. He'd done that with Gerald Ford. He'd call him up on the phone to tell him how to do economics. And Ford, who was less obsessive than Jimmy Carter was, would say, yes, Helmut, put the phone down and write something, pick up the phone. Yes, Helmut, every few minutes do that, and then ignore him. Well, Schmidt decided to do that with Carter. I'm going to show this peanut farmer how to run the world. And he gave a speech in London in which he talked about this problem of American credibility of nuclear weapons. And that was what it was. So he had started the problem by raising the question of credibility. Then after the neutron bomb went under, Schmidt went out and blamed the President of the United States. It wasn't Carter's problem. It was Schmidt's problem. Well, there you were, and Carter got egg all over his face. And I was the guy who had to clean up the mess. I'd been involved in the negotiations with the Europeans, and I was then said, somebody said to me, X and Y, we have screwed it up, to be mild about it. You fix it. Okay, so I had to kind of work that problem. Well, then coming down the road, this just ties it together, the Soviet Union started deploying a missile called the SS-20, which could hit Western Europe, but not beyond. And that brought back into play the issue, if they can only use a nuclear weapon against Western Europe, but not against the United States, will the United States be willing to use its nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union? Well, a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. I mean, all this stuff about differentiating is just absolute nonsense. Well, so we then have to spend the rest of the administration, fortunately I was then doing Middle East, to try to figure out a way to reassure the Allies. So the plan came up with, we would deploy ground-launched cruise missiles and Pershing II missiles, and at the same time trying to negotiate them down to nothing. Well, the people on the other side in Washington totally opposed this. You can't do this with the Russians. Administrations changed. We were going to go forward with these deployments, try to do some negotiating, and then they appointed, as the lead negotiator in the new administration under Reagan, Paul Nitze to be the negotiator. Well, Nitze had fought tooth and nail doing any negotiating, but now he's in charge. He has a chance to be the bright young man who solves it. And sure enough, it happened pretty quickly, because now he wasn't part of the problem. He wanted to be part of the solution, so I don't know, he could get a Nobel Prize or something like that. And so they had the so-called walk in the woods, where he went out and talked with the Soviet negotiator, and all wrapped it up when we got the two-track decision, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Agreement, SS-20s went away, Pershing IIs went away, ground-launched cruise missiles went away, and there was this agreement, we're not going to have any of these weapons until, under the Trump administration, the Soviets, at this point the Russians, started building a ground-launched cruise missile, which may or may not violate the treaty, and then President Trump abrogated the INF Treaty. Well, at this point you could say it doesn't matter, because the American nuclear commitment to the Allies against a Soviet conventional attack no longer exists. But it still, 40 years later, has messed up U.S. relations with the Allies. So we got, I said about the neutron bomb, it was like getting cowpox or chickenpox as an inoculation against smallpox later on. Because we'd messed up the neutron bomb, we did the SS-20 issue successfully.